There is a whole layer of alternative history with fantasies on a common theme. What tanks would the Germans have used should the war have continued into 1946? A shorter name for this topic is Panzerwaffe 46, and it has a lot of stories, fictions, and suggestions. For example, they say that the Germans needed just another year to replace the Panthers and the Tigers with the E-series tanks, and after that, they would introduce the E-100 and the Maus. Those would become perfect rivals for the IS-3 and the Centurions. It's time to find out what was really going on there. Germany did indeed have an emergency plan on building tanks at the end of the war. The problem was there were no E-series tanks in it. What was then? Let's figure it out, using the example of the most powerful serial tank they had, the King-Tiger. In autumn 1944, the Third Reich approved its last program on tank production. They were in such distress that nobody even thought about building some Wunderwaffe weapons. The production line consisted of only 3 chassis types: the light Hetzers, the middle Panthers, and the heavy King-Tigers. All the SPGs were to be based on those. The idea was to unify the standards of the vehicle and, by doing so, increase the number of the produced tanks and simplify their maintenance. The outdated Panzer IVs and Stuka IIIs were about to be taken out of production. All of that meant that by 1945, the Germans only had one heavy serial tank, the King-Tiger, and it was going to stay for a while. But if it was almost perfect when it came to armament and frontal armor, it had a lot of problems with its weight. With a mass of almost 70 tons, the chassis couldn't hold it anymore, and the tanks were breaking down all the time. Also, they had to limit the engine power to 600 horsepower. They needed a new, reliable engine as soon as possible, and they found one when the Maybach company offered its 900 horsepower mortar called the HL234. They almost didn't need to change anything in the tank to install that one, so they planned to issue the new tanks by the August of 1945. But in reality, by the end of the war, the engineers weren't even able to finish the stand trials. There was an alternative, the S1A16 engine by Porsche, that was already tested on the Jagdtiger. But the monopoly of Maybach was too strong for Porsche to expect an order from the government at that moment. They needed to change the transmission as well. It had been created for a tank that originally weighed 36 tons, and now it couldn't function properly. For example, it heated up so much that they had to cover it with something for the driver not to burn himself. The ZF company offered their transmission created for the Panther, but it wasn't reliable enough. They were never to solve this problem. Well, at least they were content with the armament, right? Of course, there were some ideas. By the end of 1944, the Krupp company presented a number of more or less insane projects on refining the German tanks' armaments. Some of them suggested rearming the King-Tiger, for example, by installing a 105mm gun. But they ditched the idea, as this option would heavily decrease the fire rate. So the only thing they did approve was installing a range scope. The new tanks were supposed to be produced starting July 1945. The whole thing doesn't sound very super powerful, does it? It turns out that if the war would have continued, the Germans would have had the same King-Tiger, except with a new engine, transmission, chassis, and a range scope. And that's the best-case scenario. As for the E-75 project, they cancelled it as early as 1944 without even finishing it. In the end, they would never have had the answer to the IS-3 at all.